Welcome to the Red Sneaker Writers Podcast. News, interviews, and writing tips for people who are serious about having a writing career and want some practical knowledge to help them achieve it. Your host is the nationally best-selling author of more than 50 books, William Bernhardt.
Hello, sneakers. I hope your writing is going well. For those watching this live, I apologize. We had a few technical snafus, but who cares? We're here now. Thanks for waiting for us. It's been a busy week for me. I've been putting the final touches on the sequel to Splitsville, which is coming out in September. I had a great Father's Day with all the kids, and most importantly, today, it was delivered today. Today, I scored an actual realio, trulio PlayStation 5, the be-all, end-all, I'm told, of gaming consoles. Delivered today. My son's setting it up as we speak. Yes, they said it was impossible, but we did it anyway. I mean, to tell the truth, I really know much more and enjoy much more with tabletop games and card games than video games, but that's beside the point. We have a PlayStation 5 right now, right? And this, of course, makes me think about my sound engineer, the real draw for this podcast, Jesse Ulrich, and his new giant television screen we've heard about for the last several podcasts. Jesse, have you got that thing set up yet?
It's up. It's glorious. I bought the LED lights that you wrap around it that is attached to a camera that looks down on the screen, so the colors change depending on what's on the glorious screen. It's fantastic. It would really go well with that PlayStation 5, is all I'm saying.
Well, yeah, well, no doubt. I may have to get a new television just to go with. Why do you need a camera in front of your television?
Well, so if you want the LED lights to respond to what's happening on the screen, it has to know, it either has to listen or look on the TV. So
you've got like a whole like a fireworks display,
it's pretty great.
Sound and light show.
Yeah, it's very, very fascinating, especially in like Star Wars movies with lightsabers. It's great. It's pretty great. There's some YouTube videos about it. You can look it up. But it was my second present to myself on top of the TV, and it's big. It's a big TV.
I'm impressed. Has nothing to do with the writing, but I'm still impressed. Let me remind everyone that we're still taking registrations for WriterCon, our big writers conference in Oklahoma City over Labor Day weekend. Come in person or stream from home. We've got over 60 presenters, writers, agents, publishers, and more attending. Our keynote speaker is David Farland, possibly the best writing instructor I have ever seen, who is presenting the keynote and he'll appear during the regular conference, but he's also doing a deep dive Monday masterclass with a limited number of speakers. So please visit writercon.org. That's WRITERCON.org and check it out. My interview guest today is Sarah Loudin Thomas. She is the author of many acclaimed novels, including The Sound of Rain and Miracle in a Dry Season. She's the winner of the 2015 INSPE Award. She's been a finalist for the Christie Award and many others. She and her husband live near Asheville, North Carolina. Her novels are set in West Virginia and celebrate the people, the land, and the heritage of Appalachia. We will ask her all about her writing process and where she gets her inspiration. But first, the news. Our first story today is what seems to be the latest in a series of Twitter storms leading to actual content changes in books. Erin Hildebrandt, best-selling author, I bet many of you know her and know her work. She's been called to task for a very brief dialogue snippet in her latest novel, Golden Girl. So here's what happens. Imagine this, if you haven't read the book. The main character, Vivi, compares herself to Anne Frank. Vivi and her friend Savannah are talking about staying in the attic of Savannah's home and whether Savannah's parents would approve. And she says, "You're suggesting I hide here all summer like Anne Frank?" Well, maybe it hasn't struck you as controversial yet, but some people thought it was. It set off an internet storm from people who found this insensitive and even anti-Semitic, which, it isn't. And I know the author, I know she had no such intent. Nonetheless, Hildebrandt acted quickly. She apologized and asked her publisher to delete the reference in all future editions. The publisher is Little Brown, and they announced Friday, quote, "We are removing this passage from the digital edition of the book immediately and from all future print editions." She later posted on social media that she had made, quote, "a poor choice that was tasteless and offensive," and she said, "Those of you who have read my book, Summer of '69, will realize Anne Frank was a courageous young woman whom I revere, and her story remains deeply influential in my life."
As a Jewish person and a former Holocaust scholar, I can tell you, like, that is not an anti-Semitic joke or / reference to Anne Frank.
Didn't set you off at all, huh?
It did not. I was like, that's it. Like, I was really expecting more from just the link you sent me earlier today. I'm like, oh, this is going to be good. I was like, that's it. So
well, it's scary in a way. It's almost like you can't even make reference to real life events. And I grant you, the Holocaust is a touchstone and a horror, but still, surely we should be able to talk about Anne Frank, this wonderful heroine who has inspired so many. How would you rewrite this passage, Jesse, or would you?
I mean, you're making a reference to being stuck in, an attic or whatever for a certain amount of time, and the cultural touchstone and reference for that would be Anne Frank. So, I don't just name dropping Anne Frank does not bring in all of the other things. You're referencing the story, her diary, what she experienced and how she lived. So, I mean, I guess you could make it really vague, like that one diary from World War II. Like, I don't know how you do that.
To me, that would be worse, not better.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an important historical figure and writer who we want people to know about now.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, the takeaway here is that Hildebrandt acted quickly. The tumult died down almost immediately, and the book is still selling, albeit edited somewhat, and it's still selling well. So take from that what you will, Red Sneaker writers. Second story, another major publisher is changing hands. McGraw-Hill, probably best known for their textbooks, has been sold to a private equity firm. With the prior owner, follow these numbers if you can, McGraw-Hill carried about $2.23 billion in debt. With the new owner who borrowed money to make this acquisition, the publisher now carries an additional $2.25 billion in debt. In its most recent fiscal year, unsurprisingly, the company had an operating loss. Probably some of you are thinking, this doesn't really enter into my world, but it does enter into your world, like it or not, if you're an author, whether you write textbooks or anything else, because this is an ongoing trend of publishing, consolidate, and being acquired by much larger entities who, let's face it, aren't buying this because they care so much about literature. They're buying it because they think it will make them some money. It's a good investment. And sadly, this is what seems to be happening to publishing overall, at least in many places. All right, third story. There have been a host of new publishing opportunities announced this week. I'm just going to cover a couple of them, but let me remind you, there is a Red Sneaker Facebook page, which I monitor and post to almost every day. If you want to see more of these opportunities, join the Facebook page. Anyway, here's one story. There is a new children's imprint at Astra House. Jesse's showing you their logo right now. Astra is a major publisher in this world, and they're launching a children's book imprint in fall of 2022 that will target ages newborn to 12, focusing on illustrated titles. I know many of you are writing children's books and finding that market consolidated, so here's one more opportunity. And let me also mention Draft 2 Digital is adding Box to their distribution network. Let me say up front that Draft 2 Digital and I are great friends. I use them for the books we publish. They are a frequent sponsor at WriterCon. Of course, I use them for a reason. I think they're the best aggregator or distributor for ebooks to reach those non-Amazon markets. And now, of course, even more. For a while now, they've been trying to touch libraries and library patrons. Now they're going wide to countries like Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, the UK with access to ebooks. This is a big deal because sometimes we here in America have to remind ourselves there is a market outside the United States, but there is, and as the whole book world goes global, you want to reach as many readers as you possibly can. So here's a great opportunity to do just that. Draft 2 Digital in a press release said, quote, "This is a great opportunity for our Australian and New Zealand authors to reach their local libraries, but it also gives authors worldwide a new and eager market of English reading readers," which is fantastic. That's what we all want, right? Writing is hard. Once the work is done, you want to reach as many readers as you possibly can. Many wonderful new opportunities out there for writers. And if you needed inspiration to get yourself into the writing chair today, I hope that helps. And today's interview guest should also help provide some inspiration because her work has produced many wonderful and diverse results that have touched many, many people. I'm talking about Sarah Loudin Thomas. Sarah, are you with us? There you are.
Hey,
hi, Sarah. How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Sarah, I've got a traditional first question, which due to all the tech tumult, you haven't been warned about at all unless Jesse did it. But let me just start there anyway. If you could give writers one piece of advice, and I know you've taught writing before and you could offer many, but if you had to pick just one, what would it be?
Put your butt in that chair and write. Can I say that word on?
Yeah, you can. And you would be surprised how many times I hear the same thing. I may have to rephrase my question just to get it. I mean, if you want to write, that's what you got to do, right?
I know so many people who, they're trying to come up with the perfect idea. They're researching the market. They're, thinking and research is fun, and getting out there and seeing what other people are doing is fun. But if you're going to write a book, the number one secret to writing a book is to sit down and write it. I figured out that I could write a book because I was a journalist. I was writing for a weekly newspaper in Conway, South Carolina. And after about a year, I sat down and I looked at how many articles I had written and how many words that compromised. And I said,
Right.
this is 2 books worth. Clearly, I can produce this many words. I just need to pick a topic that they can all be about.
Right. I mean, most people have the opposite problem. Their first book runs a little short, but not you, huh?
Yeah, actually, the first book did require some cutting.
So what inspired you? So you're a journalist and at some point apparently decided, I'm going to try fiction. What motivated that shifting of gears?
I had been a poet. That's what I studied in college. I love poetry.
Really?
And I had published a few poems, which pays even worse than writing.
That's right. I've done 2 poetry books myself. I know what you're talking about.
And I kind of thought, well, I love to write and I've always loved to write, but a poem, it fits on the page and you can do that. You can drink a glass of wine, you can write a poem in an evening, done. But a book, that's a lot to tackle. And I had tried to write a book that I knew was terrible. It was a contemporary romance about a journalist and it was just not very good. And I finally put it aside. And then I grew up in West Virginia. I am the 7th generation to live on my family's farm there. And I have such roots and such heritage and such history. And so I started dipping into that. And as soon as I started dipping into that history and those stories that I had grown up hearing, I found my voice and I found my stories and I haven't stopped.
Wow. You were off to the races.
Yeah.
And you're still on that farm, aren't you? Or am I wrong about that?
My husband and I live in Asheville, North Carolina, but we
Oh,
own the property in West Virginia. And
but you're on a different farm
yeah,
living.
well, it's just an acre and a half. You can't afford a farm in Asheville, North Carolina, but we're here kind of in a country. I'm looking out my window, and there's cows down the way and
Yeah.
horses next door. So I don't ever. I'm a farm girl, country girl, a mountain girl, and
Mhm.
so I always want to be in these beautiful mountains. And I'm going to say, I'm going to teach you now, if you'll forgive me. It's Appalachia.
You know, I almost did that because Sharon McCrum
Oh
and I
yes,
in earlier years were good friends, and she always said it that way, but I didn't learn apparently. But
latch like the latch on a door.
right, right. Well, I stand corrected. I've been to Asheville actually. I remember. So you're in Carl Sandburg country, right?
Oh
And I
yes.
think I also went through Thomas Wolfe's house. Is that what's really keeping you there? Is it the Carl Sandburg? Because you were a poet, so that would just make sense.
Not so much. I actually work for a children's ministry here, and I love to visit the Carl Sandburg home. It's
Hmm.
spectacular, and Thomas Wolfe downtown. But Black Mountain, which is to the east of Asheville, is kind of
Hmm.
my sweet spot these days.
Ah,
It's a little smaller, and Asheville is growing and booming, and I don't like to get into the traffic. I gotta stay on the countryside of
yeah.
town.
I think you mentioned what's one of the central problems that writers face. I mean, my dad used to say, if you've got a job, just sit down and do it and don't get up till it's done. But you cannot write a novel that way. None
No.
of us can do it in a single sitting or even close, right?
I have a friend who posted on Facebook. She's taking an at home writing retreat where she's most of her family is away, and so it's just her and her one son, and she's just buckling down. And she had written yesterday, the past 2 days, she was writing 14, 15,000 words a day,
Holy
which
smokes.
just blows my mind. The most I have ever written in a single day was 6,000 words, and it was just one of those moments where everything was flowing and it was going, and next thing
Hmm.
you know, it's hours later and you've written 6,000 words. But typically, if I can do 1,000 words a day, I'm pretty happy.
Yeah. So what's your writing process look like? Are you a morning person? Are you an outliner? Where do those thousand
Hmm.
words come from?
I was a strict pantser for a long time. I just kind of started with an idea and I jumped in and I just wrote. And what I quickly learned is that that's a good way to have to do a lot of editing later.
That's right. Good way to make it take 3 times as long, and
Yeah,
it's already going to take a long time.
you write two books and then you have to take them apart. So I do a minimal outline now, where I call it compass point plotting, where I have the beginning, that instigating, that inciting incident. Then I have, two or three key points that I know I'm going to write toward, and I know where I'm headed. Like I know kind of where I want to end up, and that way I can just aim for those story points and have a lot of fun writing creatively along the way and making things up and going in slightly different directions. But
Hmm.
I have learned, and my editor has strongly encouraged me to learn, that a little bit of plotting is a very, very good thing.
Yeah.
But as far as when I write, I have a day job. Like I said, a children's home. I do fundraising for a children's ministry, and so when I get home in the evening, I walk my dog in the woods in the national forest, because that's how I break
Mm.
from the workday to the home time. I have a nice supper with my husband, and in Appalachia it's supper, not dinner. and then and then in the evening, that's when I'll sit down and try to write that at least 1,000 words. So I I've never really written in the morning because I'm just rushing around getting ready for my day to start. I don't know if I'm a morning writer or not.
Well, you got other things to do in the
Yeah.
morning.
You put it
Last
put it
time
in
I
your
had a
calendar.
day job, I used to get up super earlier but I'm a morning person clearly, and not everybody is or needs to be.
Yeah.
So when you walk the dog, do you think about the book, or do you
Oh,
have a phone so you can dictate notes? Or
I don't dictate notes, but that is my prime plotting time. So, because I haven't plotted every point along the way when I'm writing, and when I'm in the midst of a story, I should be able to take it off my taxes somehow. I go with the dog, and
Mhm.
that's when I think, okay, this is where I am at the point in the story. What happens next? And as I walk, I just ponder and think and plot, and then next thing I know, I'm back at the car and I know
Mhm.
exactly what I'm going to write when I sit down that evening to write the next 1,000 words.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I
it's
walk
awesome.
my I walk my cat in the mornings, but I suspect your scenery is way better than mine is. I do think about the writing I'm going to do usually later on, though.
Wait, do you
How's it?
walk the cat on a leash?
Oh no, I have a satchel. I tried
Okay,
the
yes.
leash, but he didn't care for that very much.
We
So,
we had a friend who had a stroller like with windows so the
yeah,
cat could see.
I can see that. Less wear on your shoulder too. So, how's the book start for you? Does it start with an idea, or does it start with a character, or one of these stories you heard from the family? How's the process begin?
My first several novels, the Appalachian Blessing series, it's a trilogy, and it's based around a family, 3 generations of a family, and that really was pulled from family stories, and I had to teach my mom to stop trying to figure out who was who, because 'cause she'd say, "Oh, clearly Perla is this person and Casewell's that person." I'm like, "Mom, no, no, no.
Right.
There's a little bit of that person in them, and there's a little bit of you in that person." But I was very careful not to write strictly my family stories. They were used for inspiration for
That's
the
your
first
story
novel.
anyway. I
Yeah,
know.
that's
That's
it's not really. But then once I had done that, I started just dipping into I'm from West Virginia.
Mhm.
West Virginia history is so rich in history, and there's so many interesting things. I have the West Virginia Encyclopedia. It's an actual book. I could actually pull it out and show it to y'all. And it's a huge encyclopedia. And I'll just flip through that and read little snippets. And
Mhm.
I'll find interesting people and interesting facts. And my last novel, The Right Kind of Fool, actually was there's an unsolved murder in the 1930s in West Virginia,
Mhm.
and I thought I was going to write a story about this unsolved murder, a woman who's found dead in a blackberry patch. But as I was researching that, I read this line that said that her body was discovered by a deaf mute boy, and
Mm.
I was just pulled up short. It's like, man, how did that work? 1930s West Virginia. He's deaf, he's mute. How did he communicate? How did people relate to him? What would that have been like? And suddenly I was writing a novel about a 13-year-old deaf boy who discovers a dead body, and how his family is splintered, and as he reaches out to his father to help him when he discovers the body, it eventually draws the family back together. And I
Mhm.
had the best time. Um, it wasn't until later that I realized that that was uh, a bold move to try to write from the point of view of a 13-year-old boy who couldn't hear, two things that I have very little experience
Right.
with. But that's how it happens. You just find that little nugget that kind of sets you off, and then you have
Sure.
these great ideas.
That's when silence sings, right? The one you were just
That's the right kind of fool.
you got it right there. Good work.
When Silence Sings is based around the history of Thurmond, West Virginia, and that was the first time I based a book in an actual place. I had been making up my towns before that,
Mhm.
but when Silence Sings, and I make up my towns, my places, because I figure that way nobody can say, "Oh, you got that wrong. That store is not on that corner," and it's actually. But
Right.
Thurmond, West Virginia, which you can go visit today, is actually a ghost town with 7 residents. So it's like 7 people. At worst, I make 7 people mad if I get this wrong. So, and it was also called the Dodge City of the East, and there was gambling and shooting, and I mean, it was just begging to have a story
Mhm.
set there.
So it sounds like it starts with an idea, and
Mhm.
then you go. Now, come on. You said your first fictional character was a journalist. Did you not realize what your friends and family were going to do with that?
Oh yeah, that's why I threw that one away.
Okay. I got you. I mean, if you're one of the main characters, then everybody else has to be all the other characters, right? That
Well,
just makes sense.
and I have a friend who she gets accused of being one of her characters who it goes from book to book to book, and she said, really, she's all her characters. There's a little bit, I think, as writers, and I'm sure you experience this too. There's a little bit of you in every character. So for
Everyone,
I think
even the
authors are
bad
just working
guys.
out their own stuff on the page.
As long as you tell a good story, right?
Right.
Nothing wrong with that. So on your website, I notice you're posing, you're standing in front of a historical marker for Hawk's Nest Tunnel Disaster.
Yes.
What's that all about?
That is the novel that's releasing in December this year, The Finder of Forgotten Things.
Right.
The hero is a dowser, so he dowses for water. But it's centered, the historical piece that it's centered around is the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster. And this is the worst industrial disaster in US history that hardly anyone has actually heard about. It was the New River Gorge in West Virginia, and they were building a tunnel through the mountain beside the river. And the idea was that they would divert the river through. It's a 3-mile tunnel. It's an engineering marvel. It still is. They would divert the river through the tunnel, and when it comes out the other end, creates hydroelectric power. That was successful. There's a hydroelectric plant there. It still powers much of Charleston, West Virginia. But when they started this tunnel, it was in the 1930s. So these were paying jobs in the midst of the darkest days of the Depression. And all these men came to work in the tunnel, but what they didn't realize until they got in there, at least I hope they didn't realize until they got in there, what they were drilling through was over 90%, over 95% silica, which is basically glass. And as they drilled it, it created all this dust, and the men breathed it in. And you've probably heard of silicosis. And men were dying in months because what happens is they breathe it in and it gets into your lungs, and it basically turns your lungs to stone and you suffocate. It's a horrific disease. It's a horrific way to die. And hundreds of men, the official total, I think, was 746 men died, but it's
Wow.
certainly much higher than that, because there was a lot of transient workers who they couldn't keep track of, and when they got sick enough, they left or they just went off in the woods and died. So it's this real tragedy, and I have just been interested in it for so long and kind of astonished at how little known it is. So I said, well, I'm going to write a story around that. And it's challenging to have, I promise my readers, at the very least, a satisfying ending. I'm not one
Right.
of those people who's going to leave you in tears, distraught at the end. So I have a satisfying ending, but it's really hard to redeem something that killed over
Right.
700 men.
But that's in the book somehow. You wove that in, or wove a story around it, I guess I should say.
Well, and that word forgotten in the title is really key to it, is that I think one of the things that we can do for these men is not forget them.
Title, just to remind everyone, is Finder of Forgotten Things, right?
Yes.
So you've done several, how many books now? How many novels?
Finder will be number 7, and then I have 2 novellas.
So what have you learned along the way? I'll give you 3 seconds to think of it, but there must be some things you picked up, along book 3 or 4 or 6 and thought, why haven't I been doing that all along? That's so much better.
This is the best nugget I have for
Mm-hmm.
writers. We all hate the synopsis.
Right.
Universally, it's the most. You can write a 90,000 word novel, and then you have to sit down and write a 3-page synopsis, and you want to stab yourself in the eye with a pencil. So my trick to writing the synopsis is that I write a chapter by chapter synopsis. I call it my map to my book. So like chapter 1, I'll read chapter 1, and sometimes I do this as I'm writing. Often I go back as the first read through. I read chapter 1, and then I summarize chapter 1 in 2 to 3 sentences. And I do that for each chapter. And by the time you're finished, synopsis.
Yes.
But it also lets you, if you can't summarize that chapter in 2 to 3 sentences, then it's more than one chapter. And if you find you can summarize it in 1 sentence, then it's not a chapter. So it's this really handy tool to kind of make sure that your writing is your pacing is good
Right.
and that you're
Right.
covering what you need to.
Very nice. I want to invite those of you who are watching this live who stuck with us despite the tape delay to type any questions you've got into the chat box, questions you have for Sarah. I see ones there already. One of our listeners and watchers, I guess, would like to know who or what do you like to read, Sarah?
My favorite genre is historical fiction. I love, let's see, this past year or two, Lisa Wingate's
Mhm.
The Book of Lost Friends was so good. I think one of my favorite books recently has been Patty Callahan Henry's Becoming Mrs. Lewis. I mean, that book just, holy cow. When I go back and I just want to read authors that I love consistently, Wendell Berry is my favorite author.
Yeah.
Poet,
Mhm.
essayist, fiction. He's just outstanding. Other Appalachian authors, there's Ron Rash, Wiley Cash, Lee Smith. I mean, all right, if Lee Smith writes a postcard, I'll read it. So,
That's a good recommendation. Do you have a favorite? Because I know they'll want to know a favorite one of her books.
um, maybe Fair and Tender Ladies. I don't know. I'm bad. I'm bad about remembering titles. I
Yeah,
can tell you the entire story, but I can't remember the title of the book.
me too, and more so as time marches on, right? So, several of your books are historical novels, or maybe they all are. Are they
Mhm.
all? I think.
Well, the one that comes to contemporary day is
Mhm.
Tapestry of Secrets. It's the third in the trilogy, but it's dual timeline, so it has a modern day and a timeline in the 1940s.
Have you found any resistance with publishers or readers to? I know a lot of the people in the Red Sneaker Writers group are interested in historical novels, but worry that they're not going to be able to sell it, basically. But you have. Have you found any resistance to doing this kind of work?
I think historical fiction is pretty hot right now. Um, World War II is having a moment and a half.
Really?
I've actually been attending this week the historical novel society I, acronyms, Historical Novel Society of North America. They're having a virtual conference, and they interestingly were talking about some of the specific time periods within historical can be harder to sell, like biblical or prehistoric. I guess I didn't even realize that was a genre. I guess like Clan of the Cave Bear,
Yeah,
that kind
and
of
what would be
story.
the second example
I know.
of those?
So they were saying that there are some time periods that are a little tougher,
Right.
and like the 1970s now is technically historical,
Oh, that's
but
so sad.
it can be, I know it's terrible, but that can be tougher to sell. I write mid 20th century, and I always joke that I did that because my research then was like calling up my grandma and saying, "What kind of stove did you cook on?" As opposed to having to do a lot of nitty gritty
Well, that
research.
helps when you got people you can
Yeah,
talk to, right?
but Regency is big right now. Elizabethan, there's a lot of historical fiction that is really popular right now. So I say historical is go for it.
Mhm. So, what would you like to do in the future, or what are your more long? We know Finder of Forgotten Things in December, but beyond that, what should we be watching for, or what would you dream about doing, Sarah?
Oh, I just want to keep writing books.
Mhm.
And I love writing books about set in West Virginia, set in Appalachia. It's a region of the country where everybody kind of knows the jokes, and I learned some of the jokes. So I like, how do you know someone from West Virginia invented the toothbrush?
I don't know.
If it'd been anywhere else, it'd been a teeth brush. So when you're from that part of the country, you learn those jokes so you could tell them before everybody else does. And I love writing stories set there and kind of bringing attention and highlighting that part of the world, which I think is the most beautiful, most spectacular place in the world.
Right.
Um, to try to change people's view of it and to give people a different view. Books like Hillbilly Elegy. Oh, Yeah, that I'm sure it's very true to his experience, but that is not a universal experience in Appalachia.
Right. Probably not what you want to lead with when you're from that part of the world. Sarah, this has been a complete delight. Hey, maybe we can get you back in December when the new book comes
Oh,
out.
I would love that.
I'll put it on my calendar. Anyway, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
All right, then. That was fantastic. Red Sneaker Writers, remember, speaking of writing and getting good instruction, this whole Red Sneaker thing began with those books on writing that I did. There are now 10 Red Sneaker books offering practical, down-to-earth advice to help you get your writing career off the ground. Let me also remind you, as I have done before, that this podcast is ad-free. We are supported by our patrons. I have a site on the Patreon website. That's Patreon, patreon.com/Wilburn, first four letters of both names, where you can support this podcast. And believe me, even if you only contribute $1 or $2, it makes a big difference. Just this past month, we gained wonderful support from Ricky Blair in Canada, and Debbie Rhodes and Lois Melbourne, Larry Felton, who I was just emailing with this morning. And we appreciate that support very much. All right, then. Until next time, keep writing, Red Sneaker Writers. And remember, you cannot fail if you refuse to quit. See you next time.